Listen, beyond your window, the modern world is fading. But here, inside this story, the air is growing sharp with the frost of 89. We are standing in the frozen heart of the Kentucky wilderness, where the only sound is the ancient, restless wind shivering through the leafless oak. This is not just a journey into the past, it is a sanctuary for your mind. In the deep shadows of this forest, a tiny, weathered log cabin clings to the earth. There is no polished stone here, no light but the pulsing orange heartbeat of a single fireplace. As you settle deeper into your bed, imagine the smell of dry hay and the heavy grounding scent of wood smoke. We are entering a room with a dirt floor where a family named Lincoln lives in a silence so profound it feels as vast as the winter stars. You are safe here, tucked away from time itself. The cabin is a solitary outpost in a land that feels infinite. Its walls are rough-hewn logs, chinked with frozen mud to hold the biting Kentucky gale at bay. Inside, the space is small, barely enough to hold the weight of a family's dreams. Yet it feels strangely protective. This was the world of Thomas and Nancy Lincoln, a life measured not by possessions, but by the raw, unyielding rhythm of the frontier. They were a people born to a poverty that reached into every corner of their day, a struggle that was as quiet and constant as the falling snow outside. Thomas, a stern man of the earth, and Nancy, gentle and spiritual, moved through this dim space like shadows against the timber wall. In this flickering dimness, a single candle was a rare and precious luxury, a treasure saved only for the most desperate moments. Most nights were spent in the soft, amber glow of the hearth, where the fire was the only source of hope against the encroaching dark. It was on this cold dirt floor, on February 12th, that a child named Abraham took his first breath. There was no grand announcement, no herald of the presidency, or the monumental weight he would one day carry. To the wilderness, he was simply a new life, fragile and small, born into a world where even candles were too expensive to burn. Yet, even in this hollow of poverty, a light was being struck that would eventually reshape a broken nation. Close your eyes now and focus on the soft, rhythmic crackle of that fireplace. Feel the warmth radiating outward in slow, heavy waves, creating a small circle of safety against the immense chill of the winter woods. The logs shift and settle, popping softly as they release tiny, glowing sparks into the stone chimney. Outside, the world remains locked in ice, but inside there is a heavy restorative peace. This cabin is a cradle of history, a place where the smallest seed has been planted in the most forgotten soil. For young Abraham, this room was not a place of lack, but the entire map of his universe. A sanctuary where a quiet reflection began to take root in his soul. As the embers pulse with a deep, fading red, the shadows in the cabin grow long and soft, inviting you to drift further into the stillness. The frontier is vast and the winters are long, but for now, there is only the fire and the breath of a sleeping child. It is a moment of profound, necessary rest before the heavy demands of the wilderness return with the morning sun. But life in these hills was never meant to remain this quiet, and the path leading away from this dirt floor was paved with trials that would soon test the very spirit of the boy born in the shadow of the oaks. In the deep, silent stretches of the Indiana frontier, the rhythm of life was dictated by the heavy, relentless swing of the axe and the endless clearing of the stubborn brush. Most boys his age were measured by the raw strength of their backs and their growing skill with a heavy rifle. Yet young Abraham moved to a different, much quieter cadence, while others found their purpose in the physical conquest of the wilderness. He was often discovered tucked beneath the sprawling protective shade of a giant walnut tree, lost in a world that existed far beyond the jagged edge of the forest. He was a boy who preferred the smooth, quiet weight of a book to the rough wooden handle of a farm. Tula, a dreamer who saw more life in a single page of faded ink than in an entire field of cold stone. To his father, Thomas, this obsession was a baffling and frustrating mystery, a perceived distraction from the hard, manual labor required just to survive another winter. But for Abraham, those borrowed books were the only windows into a universe he had not yet touched, a way to escape the boundaries of his own poverty. Formal schooling was a rare and flickering luxury in the backwoods, a fleeting opportunity that lasted, in total, less than a single year for the young Lincoln. Where the structured classroom ended, his own iron-willed curiosity began to blaze. He would borrow any volume he could lay his hands on, sometimes walking for miles through the tangled, brambled undergrowth just to hold a few precious ink-stained pages in his calloused hand. Imagine him now, late into the night, long after the rest of the cabin has fallen into a heavy, rhythmic sleep. The room is silent, save for the soft, settling hiss of the dying fire and the steady breathing of his kin. He crouches low by the hearth, the flickering orange light dancing across the pages of Aesop's fables, Robinson Crusoe, or the rhythmic verses of Shakespeare. Each word was a tiny seed of thought, each story a map of human nature, and he devoured them with a sacred hunger that only seemed to grow the more his mind expanded. It was his stepmother, Sarah Bush Johnston, who truly saw the fire burning behind his quiet eyes. While others might have mocked his lanky, awkward frame or his strange habit of quoting poetry, to the livestock, Sarah recognized that this pursuit of knowledge was something far deeper than a mere hobby. She watched him read until the candles guttered out, repeating entire passages word for word, his young mind absorbing the logic, the grit, and the beauty of language with a precision that felt almost supernatural. She later remarked that his persistent hunger to understand the mechanics of the world, to grasp the ethereal concepts of justice, honor, and human freedom felt profoundly sacred. She became his silent protector, encouraging him to open a book even when the world demanded he swing an axe, providing a sanctuary for a spirit that was already beginning to outgrow the frontier. As you settle deeper into the stillness of your own space, try to visualize the slow, deliberate turning of those aged paper pages. They are rough, thick, and yellowed by time, smelling faintly of old dust, dried pressed flowers, and wood smoke, yet they hold the echoes of all human history. In the absolute quiet of the Indiana night, the only sound is the soft, papery rustle of the leaves and the occasional, comforting pop of a burning log. There is a deep, meditative comfort in this image. A young man, physically isolated by miles of wilderness, yet spiritually connected to the greatest thinkers of all time through the simple power of the written word. He was not merely reading. He was shaping the very architecture of a mind that would one day have to hold a fractured nation together. But this intellectual sanctuary was not built on a foundation of peace alone. The light he found within those borrowed pages was often a necessary refuge from a world that had already shown him its most cruel and unyielding face. Even as his spirit expanded with the ancient wisdom of the ages, he carried within him an invisible, heavy wound, a private burden of grief that no amount of philosophy or poetry could ever fully soothe. For as much as he learned about the triumphs of heroes and the justice of kings, he was about to learn that true, enduring growth is often forged in the cold, dark fires of a devastating personal loss. The frontier was a land of immense, untamed beauty, but it was also a place where shadows could lengthen without warning, turning a golden afternoon into a long season of hollow silence. When Abraham was just 9 years old, a tragedy struck that would alter the very texture of his soul and leave a mark that no amount of time, nor any worldly success, could ever fully erase. It began with a mysterious and deadly illness known as milk sickness, a silent thief that moved through the settlement after cows grazed upon the poisonous white snakeroot plant. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, the gentle, warm, and deeply spiritual woman who had first nurtured his quiet reflection, fell ill. In the cramped, dim confines of their Indiana cabin, the air grew heavy with the scent of bitter herbs and the soft, labored breathing of a woman losing her tenuous hold on the world. She died quickly, leaving the family shaken to its absolute core and leaving a young boy to face a wilderness that suddenly felt much colder, much larger, and far more indifferent than it had before. Imagine the heavy, physical weight of a 9-year-old boy standing in the damp, dark Indiana soil, helping his father fashion a simple raw pine coffin by hand. There was no grand funeral, no elaborate eulogy spoken under cathedral ceilings, only the stark, echoing reality of a grave dug into the stubborn earth of a lonely knoll. For Abraham, this loss was an invisible wound, a deep, jagged fracture in his childhood that never truly closed. He did not scream or rail against the vast, empty heavens. Instead, he carried his grief quietly, folding it into the very fabric of his growing personality. This early, intimate encounter with death birthed a profound and permanent melancholy, a lingering sadness that would follow him like a shadow for the rest of his life, shaping the way he looked at the world and the deep, empathetic way he understood the suffering of others. It was a burden he bore with a strange, stoic grace, a companion that walked beside him even in his most triumphant moments. As the long years passed, and he grew into a man of remarkable height and unusual strength, that inner sadness remained his most constant and reliable companion. Friends and neighbors in the decades to come would often remark on the look in his eyes, a deep, distant, and weary gaze that seemed to perceive a world of sorrow that others could not see. Even when he told his famous, meandering stories or sparked a crowded room to laughter with his dry, frontier wit, the melancholy never fully retreated from the corners of his mind. It was as if he lived with one foot in the bright light of the present, and the other in the quiet, shaded woods of his memory. This sadness did not make him weak. Rather, it gave his words a weight far beyond his years, and a moral clarity that could only be forged in the dark furnace of a great personal loss. As you drift further into the absolute stillness of this moment, listen to the imaginary wind whispering through those ancient towering Indiana trees. It is soft, morning sound, a low, rhythmic hum that moves through the tall grass and the thick timber, carrying the echoes of a family's quiet endurance. There is a strange, somber comfort in this wind, a reminder that grief is a universal language, and that even in our deepest isolation, we are connected to the ancient cycles of the earth. The forest remains a place of refuge, its deep silence offering a sanctuary where sorrow can be held without judgment or fear. Feel the coolness of the evening air as it settles over the frontier, a heavy, velvet blanket of peace that honors the memory of those who have passed before us. The woods of Indiana had taught him how to survive, how to mourn, and how to carry a burden that few could truly understand. But the restlessness in his spirit, fueled by the books he read by firelight and the grand dreams he harbored in the dark, began to pull him toward a different, wider horizon. He began to realize that his story was not meant to end in the long shadows of the Indiana forest. And so, with his grief tucked securely into his heart, like a precious, painful keepsake, he set out to find a new beginning, a chance to prove his worth in a small, hopeful town perched on the banks of the Sangamon River, a place called New Salem. By the time the year 1831 arrived, Abraham Lincoln had emerged from the deep woods of his youth, standing a remarkable 6 feet and 4 inches tall. He arrived in the small frontier settlement of New Salem, Illinois, with very little to his name, no formal pedigree, no wealth, and no clear roadmap for his future. He was a man carved from the very timber he had once split, his sleeves often too short for his long arms, and his face already weathered by the sun. Yet as he stepped into this new chapter, he carried an internal compass more valuable than any inheritance. He took a humble job as a store clerk, and though he was a stranger, the townspeople were drawn to his slow, thoughtful rhythm and his quick, meandering wit. Wah! In this dusty frontier outpost, amidst the barrels of flour and bolts of cloth, the legend of his character began to take its first solid form. It was here that the nickname Honest Abe was born, forged not in a single moment, but in 1,000 small acts of integrity. His honesty was not a performance. It was a fundamental part of his being, as natural to him as breathing. Stories began to circulate through the cabins of New Salem about the clerk who would close the shop and walk for miles through the cooling evening air just to return a few cents of change to a customer he had accidentally overcharged. If he borrowed a book, he returned it in better condition than he found it, often having memorized its contents by the light of a flickering lamp. This unwavering moral clarity won the deep trust of his neighbors, who soon began to seek his counsel on matters far beyond the walls of the general store. He served briefly as a captain in the Black Hawk War, elected by his men not for his military experience, but because they believed in his fairness and his strength of spirit. From these humble beginnings, Lincoln set his sights on the law, a profession he approached with the same quiet intensity he had used to study by the fireplace in Indiana. Without a teacher or a classroom, he taught himself, borrowing heavy law books and reading them late into the night, until the logic of the statutes became a part of his own thinking. By 1836, he passed the bar and moved to the growing, energetic town of Springfield to begin his practice. As a lawyer, he became known for his plain speech and his refusal to humiliate an opponent. He traveled the legal circuit on horseback, carrying his papers in his tall hat and treating every client, from the poorest farmer to the wealthiest merchant, with the same measured dignity. Springfield also brought Mary Todd into his life, a woman of sharp intellect who shared his passion for the shifting tides of politics. Their union was a complex landscape of deep love and private sorrow, marked by the tragic loss of their young sons, which added new layers to the melancholy he had carried since childhood. As you settle further into the tranquility of the present, imagine the rhythmic, hypnotic sound of a quill pen scratching softly across a sheet of heavy legal parchment. It is a steady, purposeful sound, like the ticking of an old clock in a quiet room. The ink flows slowly, forming careful lines of logic and justice in a world that often felt chaotic and unfair. There is a profound, meditative peace in this image, the focused mind of a man seeking order through the power of words and the weight of the law. Feel the stillness of that Springfield law office at dusk, where the only movement is the slow drift of dust motes in a shaft of fading sunlight, and the patient movement of the pen. It is a sanctuary of thought, a place where right and wrong are weighed with the same care as the grain in a frontier mill. Through his years in the courtroom, Lincoln began to see that the law was more than just a collection of rules. It was a tool for fairness and a reflection of a nation's soul. He had built a life of respect and stability, but the quiet halls of justice were about to be shaken by a storm he could not ignore. By the mid-1850s, the country was fracturing under a massive, fundamental contradiction, a land that proclaimed liberty while millions remained in chains. The honest Abe of the frontier was being called toward a darker, more dangerous path, where the law of the land would finally have to face its greatest and most painful reckoning by the mid-1850s. The fragile and hard-won peace of the American frontier had been shattered as the nation began to crack and groan under the immense, impossible weight of its own deep-seated contradictions. It called itself a proud land of liberty, a beacon of hope for the world, yet millions of human souls remained in the heavy iron chains of slavery, a national identity crisis that drew Abraham Lincoln back from the quiet, dusty halls of his law practice and into a gathering, dark-rimmed storm. He believed, with a quiet and burning conviction that radiated from his very core, that slavery was a profound moral wrong that must not be allowed to expand its shadow over the new territories. His words, spoken with a rare honesty and a razor-sharp moral clarity during the legendary debates against Stephen Douglas, traveled like a soft wind far beyond the borders of Illinois. They resonated in the hearts of a divided people, leading eventually to that cold, uncertain November night in 1860, when this tall, lanky lawyer was elected as the 16th president of a union that was already beginning to crumble into pieces. Before he could even place his hand upon the weathered Bible to take his oath, 7 states had seceded, and as the first Confederate shells fired upon Fort Sumter, the agonizing choice for war was made for him, casting the entire nation into a long, dark night of the soul. The burden of the American Civil War was not merely a political struggle. It was a heavy physical shroud that seemed to age Lincoln before the very eyes of a grieving world. He had never led an army, never studied the brutal mechanics of war, yet now the fate of an entire experiment in democracy rested squarely upon his weary and stooped shoulders. Day after day, battle after battle, the death toll rose to heights that were previously unimaginable, as young men from both the North and the South marched into muddy, anonymous fields and never returned home to their mothers. In the middle of this swirling chaos, an immense private sorrow, having lost his own beloved son, Willie, to illness within the very walls of the White House, Lincoln sought to win more than just territory. He sought to win the very soul of the country. In 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, a document of profound weight that declared all those enslaved in Confederate territory were, from that moment on and forevermore, free. But the cost of this moral victory was etched deeply in blood and bone. In July of that same year, the Battle of Gettysburg left more than 50 men killed, wounded, or missing, turning the quiet, rolling wheat fields of Pennsylvania into a vast scarred graveyard of dreams. In the cool, crisp November of 1863, Lincoln traveled to those now hallowed grounds to dedicate a final resting place for the fallen. He was not the featured orator of the day. He was a secondary guest who stood quietly as others spoke for hours. When it was finally his turn, he pulled a small, twice-folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and began to speak in a voice that was described as thin but clear. In just 272 carefully chosen words, lasting barely 2 minutes, he reached back to the very founding of the nation to remind a weary, grieving crowd that they were fighting for something eternal, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, that it might not perish from the face of the earth. He did not speak to crush his enemies with rhetoric or to boast of coming triumphs. Instead, he sought to redefine the very meaning of what it meant to be an American, proving that the nation was held together not merely by lines on a map or physical borders, but by the sacred, shared ideals of human equality, dignity, and a common purpose. As you settle now into the absolute, undisturbed stillness of your own space, try to imagine the soft, steady echo of that calm voice drifting over the silent, hallowed battlefield of Gettysburg at dusk. The thunder of the cannons and the smoke of the conflict have long since cleared, replaced by the soft, rhythmic chirping of the evening crickets and the gentle, mournful sigh of the wind through the long cemetery grass. There is a profound, meditative weight in this silence, the deep peace of a promise kept, and a nation beginning the long, slow process of remembering what it truly stood for. Visualize the tall, tired figure of the president standing against the soft, fading light of the horizon, his words hanging in the cool air like a quiet prayer for a future of reconciliation, a future he would only briefly live to see before his own light was extinguished. Lincoln lived just long enough to see the Union saved, and the brutal institution of slavery finally brought to its knees. But just 5 days after the final surrender, an assassin's bullet ensured that he would not be the one to guide the nation through the fragile peace that followed. As his funeral train journeyed slowly back across the vast prairies toward his home in Illinois, thousands upon thousands of people stood in absolute silence along the iron tracks, removing their hats to bid a final farewell to the man who had held the country together during its darkest, most terrifying hour. He left behind a legacy of iron integrity and immense compassion, a quiet, enduring strength that remains forever carved into the very heart of the land. But as the flickering light of the 19th century begins to dim and soften in our minds, we turn our gaze even further back into the mists of time. We cross the cold, churning waters of the Atlantic to find a much older, more ancient era of seafaring travelers, the bold and restless explorers who first challenged the terrifying boundaries of the known world. Beyond the quiet, landlocked woods of the American frontier and the somber, fading echoes of the Civil War, we drift much further back into the thick, swirling mists of history. We travel to a time when the salt spray of the North Atlantic was the only road known to a restless, seafaring people. Imagine the Viking longship not merely a wooden boat, but a silent marvel of ancient engineering, carefully crafted from the very heart of the dense northern forests. These vessels were born from seasoned oak, hand-forged iron, and a deep, ancestral knowledge of the sea's shifting and temperamental mood. Each long, sturdy plank was meticulously overlapped like the protective scales of a great sea serpent, held together by rivets and sealed with a thick mixture of animal hair and dark, pungent and tar to repel the freezing, brine-filled waves of the deep. This unique construction allowed the hulls to remain remarkably flexible. Instead of fighting the crushing, rigid force of the ocean, the longships would flex and bend with the natural rhythm of the tides, dancing upon the white-capped crests with a grace that seemed almost supernatural. The true genius of the longship lay in its terrifying and fluid adaptability. These ships were designed with such a shallow draft that they could glide silently into just a meter of water, allowing them to travel across the vast open ocean and then disappear into the narrow, winding veins of inland rivers where no soul expected a fleet to appear. They required no deep, sophisticated harbors. They needed only a simple stretch of moonlit sand or a muddy bank to land their weary crew. At the prow of many ships, the Norsemen carved terrifying figureheads, dragons, and serpents with snarling jaws designed specifically to ward off evil spirits and strike an ice-cold fear into the hearts of any watching from the shore. To the world they encountered, these ships were dark omens of a coming storm, but to the Vikings themselves, the longship was the ultimate, sacred symbol of total, unbridled freedom. It was their home, their floating chariot, and their only true escape from the rocky, unyielding soil of their frozen homelands. As you settle even deeper into the cool, undisturbed stillness of your own space, try to visualize the rhythmic, hypnotic splashing of 60 heavy oars, dipping in perfect, silent unison into the cold, gray waters of the North Sea. The sound is steady, purposeful, and deeply grounding, a low, watery thud, followed by the soft, swirling hiss of the wake against the smooth wooden hull. Above you, a single, massive square sail, made of coarse, heavy wool, catches the biting wind, pulling the ship forward into the vast unfolding blue of the horizon. There is a profound, meditative peace in this constant motion. The heavy world of the land has vanished, replaced entirely by the endless horizon and the salt-crusted air. Feel the gentle, swaying tilt of the deck as the ship slowly climbs a swelling wave and then slides softly down the other side. A wooden cradle moved by the ancient hand of the ocean itself. In this world of wind and water, the Vikings were not bound by the narrow borders of kings or the tiny limitations of a map. For them, the ocean was not a wall or a barrier, but a wide and inviting road that led to riches, to glory, or to a quiet new beginning in a land they had only seen in the flickering light of their dreams. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and quiet poets who transformed into living legends the very moment they stepped onto the salt-stained boards of their ships. But while the longship was the physical vessel of their journey, it was not the only force that compelled them to leave the safety of their familiar, sheltered fjords. Behind every voyage into the dark unknown lay a complex tapestry of survival and a spiritual fire that burned as bright as the dancing northern lights. What truly drove these men to risk everything against the fury of the Atlantic was a belief system that turned every single breath into a deliberate act of destiny. To truly understand the Viking spirit, one must step away from the physical world of wood and iron and enter the mythic, shadowed landscape of the Norse mind. They believed in a vast universe held together by Yggdrasil, a colossal, eternal ash tree whose roots and branches connected 9 distinct and mysterious worlds. At the very base of this world tree sat the 3 Norns' mysterious, eternal sisters who spent their infinite days spinning, measuring, and finally cutting the delicate threads of every human destiny. To a Viking, life was never a series of random accidents. It was a path already carefully woven, and one's only true duty was to meet that fate with a heart that refused to flinch or falter. This absolute, iron certainty gave them a courage that bordered on the divine, allowing them to sail their fragile ships into the blackest, most terrifying storms with the quiet knowledge that their end was already written in the stars. At the center of this mythic universe stood the All-Father, Odin, a one-eyed god of war, poetry, and a restless, driving wisdom. He had famously sacrificed an eye to drink from the well of knowledge, a permanent reminder to all Norsemen that greatness and wisdom always require a heavy price. Beside him reigned Thor, the iron-willed protector of humanity, whose mighty hammer, Mjolnir, struck the sky to create the rolling thunder that echoed over the deep fjords. These gods were not distant, cold, or indifferent. They were present in the sharp bite of the winter wind and the sudden clash of the shield. And for those who lived by the cold edge of the sword, the greatest hope was not a long, quiet life, but a brave and honorable death. They believed that the Valkyries, the warrior maidens of the gods, hovered over every bloody battlefield to hand-pick the most courageous and noble souls. For a Viking, a final breath taken in the heat of battle was not a tragic end, but a glorious, golden invitation to feast eternally in the shield-roofed halls of Valhalla. Imagine yourself now sitting comfortably within the thick timbered walls of a great Viking longhouse as the evening settles over the snowy, jagged peaks. The only light in the room comes from the long central hearth fire, its flames dancing and leaping against the soot-stained beams of the ceiling. Listen to the soft, rhythmic crackle of the dry pine logs as they settle into glowing, deep orange embers. In the shifting shadows, a skald, a master of story and song, begins to chant the ancient sagas in a low, resonant, and hypnotic voice. The words flow like a slow, deep river, telling of giants, ghosts, and the final twilight of the gods. There is a deep, ancient comfort in this flickering firelight. It is a sanctuary of warmth and story against the infinite biting cold of the northern night. Feel the comforting weight of the thick fur blankets and the grounding, earthy scent of wood smoke as the tales of old heroes wash over you, pulling you into a state of profound, mythic rest. In these great halls, death was stripped of its modern terror and replaced by the promise of eternal honor and brotherhood. To die of old age or sickness, what they called the straw death, was considered a quiet tragedy. But to fall with a blade in hand was to earn a permanent seat at Odin's magnificent table. This powerful philosophy turned the Vikings into the most fearless and relentless explorers the world had ever seen. They did not just accept risk, they welcomed it as a necessary chance to prove their worth to the Norns who watched from above. Their myths were not merely stories told for idle entertainment, but a set of sacred instructions on how to live with pride and how to face the inevitable end with an open and courageous heart. It was this unshakable foundational faith in their own destiny that gave them the incredible strength to push their longships further than any had ever dared before. With the gods watching from the heights of Asgard and the threads of their fate already spun by the sisters, the horizon held no fear, only the promise of what lay hidden beyond the map's edge. From the icy, wind-swept reaches of Greenland to the lush forests of distant new lands, the Norse spirit moved with the tide, ever outward, until it eventually encountered a civilization far to the south, a world of gold, stone, and turquoise water that shimmered like a vivid dream in the hot Mexican sun, while the stone halls of the north whispered of destiny. The true spirit of the Norsemen lived in the restless pull of the horizon, driven by overpopulation and the dwindling promise of their own limited farmland. Viking explorers began to push far beyond the known edges of the medieval map. They did not view the sea as a boundary, but as a vast, unfolding road. First, they navigated the windswept Faroe Islands, then the rocky volcanic shores of Iceland, where families established a new parliament and wrote their sagas by flickering candlelight. But even Iceland was not far enough for the most daring. By the late 10th century, a bold chieftain named Eric the Red, exiled for his fiery temper, set sail into the biting spray and reached a vast icy coastline. He named it Greenland, a hopeful name meant to lure settlers to its rugged shores. Yet the most legendary voyage was still to come, led by Eric's son, Leif Erikson Dinua. Around the year 1000 before Spanish sails would appear in the Caribbean, Leif pushed his longship even further west into the unknown mist. He was seeking a land rumored by sailors who had been blown off course, a land of forests, grasslands, and wild grapes. When he finally made landfall, he called it Vinland, a place we now know as part of modern-day Newfoundland, in Canada. Here, At a site called Meadows, the Norse built a small settlement, marking the first known European presence in North America. It was a monumental achievement of navigation and courage, performed without compasses or charts, guided only by the stars and the flight of birds. The great reveal of these voyages is that they were not driven by the bloodlust often attributed to the Viking Age. These were not raids, they were migrations of hope. The Norsemen who crossed the Atlantic were seeking new horizons where their families could thrive, where their sheep could graze, and where they could build homes far from the reach of warring king. They were seekers of possibility, carrying their traditions and their gods across a distance that few other cultures could even imagine. Though the settlement in Vinland did not last due to the immense distance from home and conflicts with indigenous peoples, the fact that they arrived at all remains a testament to a spirit that refused to be bounded by fear. As you drift now into a state of quiet contemplation, try to visualize the sight of deep green forests slowly appearing through a thick morning fog. The air is cool and smells of pine needles, damp earth, and the fresh, clean scent of an undiscovered world. The longship glides silently through the glassy water, its prow cutting a soft, rhythmic wake as the crew gazes in awe at the lush, towering timber. There is a profound, meditative peace in this discovery, the feeling of standing on the threshold of something entirely new and untouched. Feel the stillness of the North American coast, where the only sound is the distant cry of a gull and the gentle lap of the tide against the pristine shore. The Norse spirit had reached its furthest extent, proving that even the most terrifying oceans could be crossed by those with purpose and integrity. But while one culture was pushing west across the salt and the spray, another civilization was flourishing far to the south, building a world of stone and symmetry that seemed to defy nature itself. While the Vikings were seafaring explorers of the cold Atlantic, another people were masters of the lake, constructing a city of dreams that shimmered like a jewel beneath the Mexican sun. Long before the first Spanish sails appeared on the horizon, there stood a city that seemed to rise from the water like a vivid, impossible dream. Tenochtitlan, the magnificent capital of the Aztec Empire, was founded in 1325 on a swampy island within Lake. According to legend, the Aztecs were guided there by a divine prophecy. They were to build their home where they saw an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. From those humble, muddy beginnings, they constructed a metropolis of stone and symmetry that reached toward the heaven. By the early 1500s, it had become one of the largest and most sophisticated cities in the entire world, home to over 200 feat of engineering that rivaled and often surpassed the great capitals of Europe. Imagine walking along the great causeways that connected the island to the mainland. Avenues so wide and clean, they sparkled in the afternoon light. The city was a maze of turquoise canals, bustling with swift canoes, carrying tribute from across the empire, vibrant feathers, precious jade, cacao, and fresh maize. At the heart of it all stood the Templo Mayor, a massive double pyramid dedicated to the gods of war and rain. Its stone steps rising high above the white buildings and bustling marketplaces. It was a world of high structure and deep ritual, ruled by Montezuma II, an emperor who lived as a divine representative of the gods, surrounded by omens and advisors. The true reveal of Tenochtitlan was its sheer, staggering perfection. To the Spaniards who would eventually witness it, the city was cleaner, larger, and more orderly than anything they had ever imagined. Some soldiers whispered that they had walked into a dream, unable to reconcile the barbarism they expected with the shimmering beauty they found. The Aztecs had created an urban paradise with floating gardens, advanced sanitation, and a public life so vibrant It hummed like a living hive. It was a civilization at its absolute pinnacle, a testament to what could be built when human ambition is fueled by a sense of divine purpose. As you settle further into the tranquility of the present, try to visualize the gentle, rhythmic lapping of water against the Chayanampass, the famous floating gardens of the city. These were man-made islands of rich soil where flowers and crops grew in abundance, their roots drinking from the lake's cool depths. The air is warm and carries the sweet, intoxicating scent of jasmine, damp earth, and ripening fruit. There is a profound hypnotic peace in the sound of the water moving through the canals, a liquid heartbeat that sustained the entire empire. Feel the stillness of the lake at sunset, when the white temples reflect the orange and purple hues of the sky, and the city seems to float between the earth and the heavens. Tenochtitlan stood tall and proud, a sanctuary of stone and water that seemed destined to last forever. The Aztecs believed they were maintaining the very balance of the universe through their rituals and their rule. But far beyond the mountains and the lakes, across an ocean they did not know existed, a different kind of destiny was approaching. A fleet of ships had set sail, carrying men of iron and fire, an ancient prophecy of bearded men, returning from the east, was about to become a devastating reality. On November 8, 1519, the history of the world shifted on its axis as two men stood face to face for the first time. One was Hernán Cortés, a Spanish conquistador who had burned his ships to ensure there was no retreat, driven by a dangerous hunger for gold and glory. The other was Montezuma II, the divine emperor of the Aztecs, a man of deep spirituality and cautious wisdom who ruled from a palace of gold and feathers. It was not merely a meeting of two leaders. It was a collision of two entirely different realities, each looking into the other as if through a distorted golden mirror. The days that followed were a masterclass in tragic misunderstanding, because they could only speak through layers of translation from the native Nahuatl to Mayan, and finally to Spanish. Every word was a fragile bridge. Meaning often slipped through the cracks when Montezuma welcomed Cortés with ceremony and housed him in a royal palace. He was practicing the high hospitality of a sovereign ruler, perhaps hoping to learn the intent of these bearded gods before taking action. But to the Spaniards, this reception was viewed through a lens of conquest. They mistook Montezuma's diplomacy for submission and his ritualized respect for a sign of weakness. The reveal of this encounter lies in the tragic irony of their false understanding. The Aztecs believed they were maintaining a cosmic balance by receiving these strangers, while the Spanish believed they had already gained control of an empire. Respect was mistaken for surrender. Hospitality was mistaken for fear. Behind the smiles and the gifts of gold, Cortés was already calculating the city's defenses, while Montezuma was searching the stars and the omens for a way to save his people from a storm he could sense was coming. They were two civilizations speaking at once, yet neither was truly heard. As you drift deeper into the stillness of this night, try to feel the heavy, silent heat of a palace courtyard in Tenochtitlan at dusk. The air is thick and still, held between the great stone walls, smelling of ancient incense and the dampness of the nearby lake. There is a profound, uneasy peace in this atmosphere, the kind of quiet that precedes a great upheaval. Imagine the long shadows of the pyramids stretching across the plaza, and the distant, rhythmic thrum of a drum somewhere in the city. Feel the weight of the moment, where the future of a million souls hangs in the balance, suspended in the amber light of a fading afternoon. In this palace of stone, the illusion of peace remained for a short time, but the foundation of the empire was already beginning to crack. The Spanish were honored guests who would soon become captors, and the emperor's own people were beginning to whisper that their leader had bowed too far. A single spark of paranoia, a single act of violence was all it would take to turn this dream of gold into a nightmare of ash. The golden mirror was about to shatter, and the night of sorrows was waiting just beyond the horizon. The fragile illusion of a peaceful coexistence within the shimmering city of Tenochtitlan evaporated in a single devastating stroke of violence that echoed through the stone plazas. While Hernan Cortés was away from the city, his second in command, Pedro de Alvarado, fueled by a dark paranoia, launched a brutal, unprovoked massacre within the courtyard of the great temple during a sacred festival. The music stopped, the ceremonial drums fell silent, and the once welcoming avenues of the capital turned into a boiling cage of fury and resentment. Montezuma, the divine emperor who had once sought to balance the scales of diplomacy, now sat as a weary prisoner in his own palace, his soft voice no longer able to reach or calm the enraged tides of his people. When he finally climbed to the rooftop to plead for silence, he was met not with the ancient reverence of his subjects, but with a rain of stones. Days later, the great ruler died in a heavy, hollow silence, and with him died the last fragile hope of a bloodless resolution. On the dark night of June 30th, 1520, a night that would forever be etched into history as La Noche Triste, or the Night of Sorrows, the Spaniards and their native allies attempted a desperate final escape from the island city. Under a moonless, ink-black sky and a relentless pouring summer rain, they slipped out of their quarters, hoping to cross the narrow wooden causeways before the Aztec warriors realized. But the darkness offered no protection from thousands of canoes hidden in the tall reeds of Lake Texcoco. The Aztecs launched a coordinated and fierce attack. The causeways, slick with rain and warm blood, became narrow bottlenecks of absolute chaos where men fought blindly in the shadows, their desperate screams drowned out by the rolling thunder and the heavy splashing of the lake water. The profound and tragic reveal of that night was that it was not just the Aztec obsidian blades that claimed the lives of the retreating soldiers, but their own insatiable greed. Many of the Spaniards had laden themselves with as much looted Aztec gold as they could physically carry, stuffing their heavy pockets and their iron armor with the stolen treasures of a civilization. As they slipped on the wet, mossy stones or were pushed into the churning water, the sheer, immense weight of that gold dragged them down into the lightless depths of the lake. They were literally drowned by the very riches they had crossed an ocean to find, their bodies sinking into the deep silt alongside the shattered remains of their worldly ambitions. By dawn, the dream of an easy conquest had been reduced to ash, leaving only a few broken survivors to weep beneath a cypress tree on the distant shore. As you drift now into the deep, undisturbed stillness of this evening, try to visualize the rhythmic sound of that relentless rain washing over the scorched, blood-stained stones of the great temple. The air is cool and heavy with the scent of wet earth and the faint, lingering aroma of ancient, burnt incense. There is a profound, somber peace in this constant downpour, a liquid curtain that falls over the tragedy, cleaning the slate of the city and offering a moment of quiet, necessary reflection amidst the wreckage. Feel the weight of the water as it cascades down the steep stone sides of the pyramids, a steady, hypnotic pulse that reminds us of the earth's quiet indifference to the rise and fall of human empires. The lake remains calm, its turquoise waters swallowing the secrets of the night, while the city waits in a heavy, rain-soaked silence for a tomorrow that will never be the same. The fall of Tenochtitlan was a monumental collision of worlds that left a permanent, aching scar upon the land. Though the empire would eventually be buried beneath the stones of a new capital, its heart continued to beat quietly in the language and the resilient spirit of its people. But as we leave the warm, humid air of Mexico and move forward through the long centuries, we find that the struggle for survival and the weight of history would eventually draw humanity back into the very earth they sought to conquer. Hundreds of years later, in a much different corner of the world, men would once again find themselves trapped in a landscape of mud and stone, facing a silence that held a different, more modern kind of terror. By the early 20th century, the nature of human conflict had been transformed by the cold, unfeeling machinery of the industrial age, leading to a war that many had believed would be over in a few short months. Instead, it became a slow, agonizing grind that saw millions of young men burrowing deep into the very soil of Europe, stretching from the Belgian coast all the way to the jagged Swiss border, was a zigzagging, endless network of trenches, narrow, deep channels carved into the earth. These were not merely fortifications, they were a way of life, defined by an exhausting rhythm of mud, blood, and tangled iron wire. Men lived in holes barely wide enough for two people to pass, sleeping in shallow, cramped dugouts while just inches above their heads. The world was being torn apart by an artillery thunder that never seemed to end. In these trenches, survival was a relentless daily battle against the cold elements as much as the invisible enemy. The floor, churned by constant rain and thousands of heavy iron-shod boots, often became a thick gray soup of rot and standing water that rose high above a man's ankles. Rats thrived in the damp, dark shadows, growing fat on the remains of the fallen. The constant, biting itching of lice became a companion as familiar as the wood of a rifle. Between the sudden, terrifying barrages of high-explosive shells, there were long, stretching hours of an absolute, unnatural silence. It was a world entirely defined by waiting for a shouted order, waiting for a cold meal, and waiting for the pale sun to rise over the tangled, rusted mess of no man's land. Yet, within this landscape of total desolation, the human spirit found quiet ways to anchor itself to the soft world it had left far behind. The profound and beautiful reveal of life in the trenches was that the most powerful weapon a soldier possessed was not his heavy rifle or his sharpened bayonet, but a simple, fragile scrap of paper. Mail call was the most sacred and anticipated moment of the day. A delicate bridge of ink and paper between the freezing mud of the front lines and the distant warmth of a home fireside. A letter from a wife, a sweetheart, or a worried mother was proof that the soldier was still remembered as a human being, not just a nameless number on a growing casualty list. These letters, often read over and over by the dim light of a guttering candle in a damp dugout, held the mysterious power to save a man's spirit when everything else felt lost to the dark. They carried the faint sense of perfume, the memory of dried flowers, and the comforting everyday news of a world that was still at peace, providing a sanctuary of thought that no heavy artillery shell could ever hope to destroy. As you settle now into the deep, restorative tranquility of your own bed, try to visualize the muffled, hauntingly beautiful sound of a distant harmonica playing in a midnight dugout. The melody is slow, drifting, and soulful, a familiar song from home that carries through the thick, damp earth and the heavy, still air of the trench. There is a profound, meditative peace in this small sound, a tiny spark of enduring humanity In a world of cold machinery, listen to the rhythmic, soft dripping of rainwater from a wooden support beam, and the distant, low hum of a quiet conversation between brothers who have shared everything from their meager rations to their deepest fear. Feel the comforting weight of the heavy wool blankets and the grounding, ancient stillness of the earth as the music wraps around you like a soft, auditory blanket that honors the quiet endurance of those who waited in the dark. In the trenches, every sunrise was a hard-won victory, and every letter was a lifeline that kept the human heart from turning to cold stone. Men found a deep brotherhood, forged not in the search for glory, but in the shared humble struggle of the mud and the wire. They learned that even in the most inhuman and terrifying conditions, compassion, humor, and love could somehow survive. It was this stubborn, enduring humanity that would eventually lead to a moment so rare and so powerful that it seemed to defy the very laws of war itself. Even in the deepest desolation of the freezing Western Front, a moment of impossible peace was waiting to happen. A brief, glowing sliver of light that would prove that the spirit of man is never truly broken, no matter how deep the trench. It was Christmas Eve, 1914, the first long, bitter winter of a war that many had confidently believed would be finished before the autumn leaves had even begun to fall. The trenches were hollowed by a biting, silver frost, and exhausted soldiers huddled deep beneath thin, damp blankets, their quiet thoughts drifting far away to the flickering warmth of family firesides and the long-lost peace of home. Then, across the scarred and frozen desolation of no man's land, an entirely unfamiliar sound began to rise through the crisp, midnight air, the sound of singing. From the German lines, the soft, hauntingly melodic strains of Still Nacht floated like a ghost over the jagged barbed wire. British troops, at first stunned and confused by the ethereal beauty of the ancient hymn, soon began to answer with their own carols, their deep voices joining in a fragile, unintended harmony that seemed to momentarily suspend the very laws of gravity and conflict. One by one, hesitant and mud-caked heads began to rise slowly above the frozen parapets, peering into the thick darkness to see if the enemy was, for this one night, still an enemy. What followed would become one of the most profoundly human moments in the entire history of a deeply inhuman and mechanized conflict. Without a single formal order from their distant superiors, and in total, beautiful defiance of the heavy machinery of war, soldiers began to climb out of their protective trenches and walk slowly into the open moonlight. They met in the very middle of that dead, shell-torn space, a place usually reserved only for blood, iron, and sorrow, and they simply shook hands. Enemies who had been desperately trying to kill one another only hours before now exchanged small, humble treasures, brass buttons, pinches of tobacco, and melting bits of chocolate. Someone produced a tattered ball, and a spontaneous game of football erupted in the slushy mud and white snow, with heavy rifles left behind, and the rigid boundaries of warring nations momentarily forgot. There were no scores kept, and no formal rules followed. There was only the rhythmic sound of heavy leather boots kicking through the freezing slush, and the shared, pure joy of men who had temporarily reclaimed their stolen souls from the mud of the earth. The beautiful and enduring reveal of this spontaneous truce was that for one singular, glowing day, the shared humanity of the common soldier rose far above the cold, calculated orders of distant, unfeeling generals. It was a peace not signed with expensive ink on official parchment, but chosen and ratified with frozen hands and open, aching hearts. They buried their dead together in the frozen soil, lit small, flickering candles along the edges of the trenches, and shared songs in languages they did not fully speak, yet understood perfectly through the shared, silent experience of human suffering. For a brief, golden sliver of time, there was no other side, only a collection of men who were cold, desperately tired, and aching for a peace. It proved, beyond any doubt, that beneath every heavy wool uniform, regardless of the colorful flag it bore, there was a beating heart capable of immense compassion, even on the most violent and blood-soaked ground on earth. As you settle now into the absolute, undisturbed stillness of the present moment, try to visualize the quiet, genuine laughter of these weary men as they stand together in the falling snow. They are leaning comfortably against the rusted barbed wire, showing one another faded, dog-eared photographs of wives, sweethearts, and small children they haven't held in many long months. There is a profound, meditative peace in this mental image, the soft sound of low, rhythmic whispers, and the sight of shared cigarettes glowing like tiny, pulsing stars in the vast winter dark. Feel the sharp, clean crispness of the winter air, and the grounding, heavy weight of the snow as it falls white, silent and perfect, covering the deep scars and shell holes of the battlefield in a thick, velvet blanket of truce. It is a sanctuary of the human spirit, a gentle reminder that even in the darkest heart of winter, the light of simple human kindness can still find a way to flicker and burn. But as the pale sun rose on the cold days that followed, the immense weight of the war returned with a heavy, familiar gravity. Generals, furious and embarrassed at this display of fraternity, issued strict, threatening orders forbidding any further contact, and the heavy artillery began its rhythmic, thundering business once more. The truce was never repeated on such a grand scale, and the soldiers returned to the darkness of their trenches to continue the grim business of survival. Yet, for those who were there, the memory remained as a permanent sliver of light that refused to fade, a quiet, undeniable proof that the spirit of man is never truly broken by the mud. The guns would eventually stop for good, leaving only the long, lingering echoes of history to whisper softly through the quiet fields where the red poppies now bloom in the sun. The long lingering echoes of those great and terrible conflicts began to fade as the heavy guns finally fell silent at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Across the vast western front, the zigzagging, deep trenches that had once been a permanent, muddy home for millions of souls began to sit in an abandoned, hollow, and peaceful silence. Slowly, as the relentless seasons turned, these deep, jagged scars in the earth started to sink back into the heavy soil, reclaimed and softened by the very land that had been torn apart for 4 long, agonizing years. The iron-shod boots, rusted rifles, and the many letters that were never sent were left behind in the dark, small, quiet, and sacred pieces of lives that had once filled those narrow, timbered walls, just as the dragon-headed longships of the north had eventually faded from the salt-stained horizon, leaving only the soft, fading ripple of the wake behind. The intense era of the Great War began to dissolve into the long, stretching mists of human memory. The men who had lived within the freezing mud and the rusted wire returned eventually to their homes. But they did not return as the same people who had left. They carried within them a second, invisible home, a quiet, private prison of thought where the familiar, sunlit streets of their hometowns felt strangely foreign, and the innocent laughter of children sounded like a distant, unreachable music. Some found a lasting sanctuary in the absolute silence, while others were haunted by the heavy, lingering weight of what they had witnessed in the dark. Yet, from this immense and staggering darkness came a profound, enduring, and beautiful resilience. They proved in the end that the human spirit, much like the seasoned oak of a Viking ship or the ironclad integrity of a humble frontier lawyer, possesses unrelenting strength that can truly endure the unendurable. Their true legacy is not found in grand, sprawling empires or cold marble ruins, but in the fierce independence of their descendants and the profound moral clarity they left behind for us to find. The deep and final reveal of these interlocking histories is that true greatness does not require the flash of perfection, nor does it demand the blinding light of a grand stage. It requires only a steady, unwavering purpose, a total commitment to ironclad integrity, and a heart that simply refuses to turn away from what is right. It is found in the quiet boy reading by the flickering orange light of a frontier cabin fire, the restless sailor pushing his dragon-headed ship into the unknown, misty horizon, and the weary soldier sharing a song of home in the freezing dark of no man's land. These are the delicate threads that weave the rich fabric of our shared humanity, a gentle reminder that even in the most broken and chaotic of worlds, compassion, reason, and courage can still find a way to bloom in the silence. As you drift now into the absolute, restorative, and heavy peace of the present moment, try to listen to the sound of the ancient wind whispering through the tall emerald green grass where battlefields once stood. It is a soft, rhythmic, and hypnotic hum that moves gently over the earth, carrying the faint voices of those who endured with a quiet and unrelenting courage. There is a profound, meditative comfort in this natural sound, the feeling of the world slowly and patiently healing its own deep wound. Visualize the bright red poppies nodding slowly in the warm sunlight, and the birds singing once again in the leafy trees that were once shattered by the thunder of the guns. The air is fresh still, and perfect, a thick velvet blanket of tranquility that honors the memory of every seeker, every explorer, and every survivor. The longships have finally rested in the deep, the pens of the lawyers have stilled, and the trenches have returned at last to the warm embrace of the soil. The stories have all been told, and their soft echoes now serve only to guide you into a deep, dreamless, and healing sleep. The world around you is at peace, held safely in the ancient cradle of history and the soft, velvet safety of the night. Rest now, for your long journey through the mists of time is complete, and the eternal stillness of the dark is here to welcome you home.